Okay, so a very, very warm welcome to everyone. And I'm especially excited and very, very pleased this afternoon or this morning, in some cases, to welcome Dr. Dada Docot, who's going to be giving our anthropology research seminar today. Dada is an assistant professor of anthropology at Purdue University, although I should also say that she is currently zooming in from California, where it's about 5 in the morning. Thank you very, very much for agreeing to talk at this slightly crazy hour. And her research focuses on the Philippines and the Filipino diaspora. So I understand she's currently working on a book project that presents an ethnographic account of everyday life in her hometown in the southeast part of Luzon Island in the Philippines, the so-called town of dollars. And she is also involved in various conversations about the postcolonial condition, colonization, precarity, and growing global inequality. So we're absolutely delighted to have you with us today, Dada, and I'll now hand things over to you. So welcome.
Hi, good morning from my side of the world. Thank you very much for this invitation. So I'm going to be reading from a script, so I don't go on for an hour. All right. So once again, thanks to everyone for coming today. And in the beginning, I'm going to introduce my field site and talk about the paper that I'm presenting today. I'm going to start now.
Dada, have you got your screen sharing on?
Oh, not yet, sorry. All right. All right. And then I think. All right. My field site is a place where I trace my roots, a relatively unassuming and predominantly agricultural town called Nabua, located in the southeast of Luzon Island, Philippines. It is called by its residents the town of dollars. In 1898, after 333 years of colonization, Spain relinquished the Philippines to the US. The history of my hometown is linked with this transition and with the wealth and prestige brought back home by young men who started joining the US Navy's racialized and segregated steward rank when the US colonial government started recruiting in 1901. As stewards, Nabueños served in the naval kitchens, fixed bunks, and worked as assistants of naval officers. Facing a seemingly endless cycle of turbulence wrought by uninvited wars, repercussions of which were intimately felt at home, and later avoiding forced labor in the Japanese imperial camps stationed in the area during World War II, among a range of other reasons, young Nabueños saw joining the US Navy as an option for upward mobility and as a form of escape or adventure. Here are some photos from my hometown. This is a common rice field, the river running through the town. This is from the annual festival, and these are gay majorettes performing, and residents in one village gathering, making baskets. Nabua's local government embraces the town's moniker. My hometown's official seal prominently features a US Navy man and an anchor surrounded by taro and rice, the town's main agricultural products. However, Nabua is nestled in one of the poorest provinces in the Philippines, with its present moment that can be described by what Lauren Berlant calls crisis ordinariness. Nabua has the highest incidence of poverty in the district of Camarines Sur in the Bicol region, with 1/3 of its household classified as poor. The moniker appears to be a stalemate for the majority of Nabueños, as it signifies successful migration trajectories that they cannot relate to, and it promotes and fortifies a culture of migration and aspirations for mobility elsewhere. Today, the Philippines has become one of the world's biggest suppliers of state-brokered migrants, with 10% of its population working overseas. Several members of my extended family joined the US Navy decades ago, while the younger generation have joined the force of Filipino workers from rural towns to Manila and then overseas. Our home is one that has been left empty for a very long time, with many of my relatives living and working overseas. Arriving in the Philippines, American colonial administrators divided the archipelago geographically into lowlands and highlands. The highlands were viewed as more complex and interesting compared to the assimilated lowlands like my town. This tradition of administration led to a form of scholarship aligned with colonial efforts to map the Philippines, eventually trickling down to Filipinos whose projects steered away from doing an anthropology of their own community. Doing an anthropology of the hometown, it could be argued on one hand, disrupts myths about anthropological objectivity and subject making. In the case of the Philippines, studying the hometown runs against American anthropology's residual obsessions with studying the exotic other. However, what else is there beyond subverting earlier orientations where anthropological fieldwork could be held? In my abstract for today's presentation, I wrote that an anthropology of the hometown opens space for meditating on the messiness of post-colonial life. If anyone is interested, I have written in the American Association of Geographers Geohumanities about my attempt to unlearn methodological disciplining through thinking about what I have called negative productions. In this piece, I reflected on seemingly non-productive events such as the non-screening of a film that I made starring my mother that was already televised worldwide on the Filipino channel. I also think about the non-filming of events involving US Navy men, even if the president of their organization, my uncle, already told me to film their stories, which meant that gaining access was not going to be difficult. I argued in this piece to rethink negative events or non-happenings as productive, not in the sense of academic productivity, but in upholding or our ethical commitments and the relations that matter to us. In current anthropology, I proposed a method that I called the ethnographic meta-commentary, an experiential, processual, and protracted approach to ethnography. This method includes the process of writing about what I called furtherings, or self-reflective and open-ended explorations that unpack aspects of our projects that have retreated from our manuscripts and other research outputs such as film and other multimodal work. This is a response to Nikolai Sorinchaikov's observation that complexity is a good question but a bad answer. By that, Sorinchaikov critiques the tendency of anthropologists to deploy complexity as the defining characteristic of their ethnographic project. Drawing upon my fieldwork in the hometown and following diasporic stories, I offer in these pieces ways of disrupting forms of disciplining, producing what Johannes Fabian calls the caricature of ethnography that could exaggerate or simplify analysis and that could filter out what Fabian calls experiential noise. In my work, I am interested in sensing and understanding the experiential noise that Fabian writes about. I am interested in those times that are wasted, in the plans that are thrown out, in the long delays, in the days of melancholia spent reflecting on the contents of of colonial archives with really troubling content. Looking back to what I have written so far on my research in my hometown and among the Filipino diaspora, I realized that trauma was in fact not among the themes that I have used to examine the confounding moments from fieldwork that haunted and that continue to haunt me as if begging to be recognized. I am beginning to inquire into examining conflicting and confusing stories at home, drawing from the colonization theory paired with trauma studies. Michael Rothberg calls for the decolonization of trauma studies, which to him means moving away from understanding trauma as a singular event to considering its collective, spatial, and material instead of individual, temporal, and linguistic dimensions. For Rothberg, Holocaust survivors, for example, can pinpoint a particular time in history and the perpetrators of violence. Within such a context, terms of responsibility and accountability can be identified. Following Rothberg, Irene Visser notes that trauma, understood as a singular event, is represented by the metaphor of a sharp blade that once caused pain and that becomes implanted in one's consciousness for a long time. Visser notes that the analogy would look very different for the kind of pain that was caused by, quote, cumulative hurt of long years of repression that constitutes the trauma of colonialism with its repeated and cumulative stressor events, end quote. Survivors of traumatic events, for Rebecca Lester, find ways to go on living, sometimes not necessarily by confronting trauma and conflict, but through ongoing, this is a quote, ongoing, iterative, continuous processes of meaning making that emerge in relationship with others across a variety of levels and contexts and through time, end quote. Decolonization has emerged as a theory, process, project, and commitment that has become a buzzword in the academy and mainstream conversations. Definitions of decolonization often center on broadening discourse beyond the Western canon, on accommodating different perspectives in a productive dialogue, on rebuilding academic citation practices that uplift marginalized scholars, and on critiquing European colonialism that enabled Western-centric discourse. I take with me Tuck and Young's insight that decolonization, quote, will take a different shape in many contexts around the world. Settlers came to the native lands in North America in many forms, as enslaved workers, as colonized peoples recruited into the military, such as people from Naboat, as high or low skilled laborers, among others, creating a diverse group of settlers, which then exponentially complicates what is meant by decolonization, end quote. Taking these conversations to Southeast Asia, I agree with Juno Salazar Pareñas that it is essential to interrogate the transferability of decolonizing approaches and projects in other places beyond the West. Rather than indigenous knowledge, her Iban and Malay informants profess ignorance because colonialism disrupted the transfer of knowledge intergenerationally. In many places in Southeast Asia, indigenous knowledge blended with those introduced by modernity. In such cases, what might be regarded as indigenous or local could be an amalgamation of knowledges from cultural encounters. Thus, applying decoloniality in Southeast Asia as it is used in the West for Pareñas would be a misappropriation and to an extent, culturally imperialist. On the slide are some of the literature on decolonization that I draw from. Learning from these, and also to those who are looking for readings, I highly suggest this set. Learning from these paired with scholarship on decolonizing trauma, I am prompted to remember that decoloniality and approaches to trauma unfold in different ways in different places. Decolonization and trauma theory and their related projects must not be used as a formula in the same way that analytical concepts in anthropology, for example, in studying ritual, have become routine. Seeking possibilities within this pairing, I ask, what are the limits and possibilities of decolonization projects and examining places such as the town of Dollars, where the reverberations of intergenerational and historical trauma may not be immediately recognizable? If trauma is unrecognized by formerly colonized peoples, what would a historical reckoning look like for them? To answer these questions, I now introduce three monuments that lie at the centro, or the center, of the town of Dollars. This trinity of public monuments communicate the paradox at the heart of residents' projects to project their history in very grand ways. Well, not very, but you will see some photos later. They illustrate the intermingling of the repercussions of what I call multiple colonialisms in the hometown, as well as the cumulative hurt that Visser writes about. Like Nabua's official seal, I approach these monuments as part of my hometown's post-colonial archive. It is only this year, with much gratitude to the Black Lives Matter movement protests, that I began viewing these monuments at a different light, in a different light. As colonial monuments fell around the world, I started imagining what historical reckoning would look like in my hometown if we were to inquire into our familiar monuments. What follows is an excerpt from a chapter that I started writing this summer, the final version of which is appearing in a collection on decolonizing Philippine studies. Different iterations of this portion of my talk were presented at UCLA, the University of Wisconsin in the US, and Northwest College in Canada. I am very thankful for the hosts of my lectures for the invitations, as these provided me with a space to develop my ideas. The first monument. The first monument is of the three agta at the main roundabout, which epitomizes Nabo's claim to indigeneity. Built in 1997 by the municipal government, the statue depicts an agta family carrying bamboo slit drums, sculpted as if offering a ceremonial dance to the gods. Ricardo Maria Nolasco describes the agta people as people with dark-colored skins, short stature, and kinky hair. The people of Nabua want to honor the agta by elevating them to the most exceptional spot at the very center of the town. Still, the agta have, in fact, not resided in Nabua in recent memory. Non-agta residents in the neighboring city of Iriga, where there are agta settlements, criticized Nabua for its co-opting of the agta group into its history-making through public monuments and in its narrative on how it became a Christian town. On the 2nd of May every year, a street parade passes through the roundabout where the monument of the agta stands. Nabueño children, youth, and adults representing various groups participate in contemporary renditions of indigenous attire. Some participants wear colorful and glittery outfit adorned with elaborate jewelry of golden necklaces and rings reminiscent of the costumes of Muslim tribes in Mindanao. Some don natural costumes made with tree bark, hemp, and native grass, carrying food offerings such as coconuts. Participants dance on the streets as they rhythmically beat sticks on their bamboo slit drums while chanting prayers to Balahala, or the pagan god. Others carry warrior shields painted with geometric patterns that are supposed to depict native aesthetics. Each team has a muse who carries the image of Inang Katipanan, or the Lady of the Covenant, who is a local Marian icon. Inang Katipanan, or the Lady of the Covenant, is an icon believed to protect the town from natural disasters. Other participants blacken their faces with charcoal or grease to play agta. In these costumes, Nabueños' recognition of their ancestors is confusing and unclear, if not muddled. I'll just show a bit of clip. So the parade ends at the quadrangle of my former high school, where the street parade participants convene into groups to perform Nabua's supposed foundation story through dance, while an accompanying narration is blasted on the speakers. The narrative is set sometime in the early years of Spanish colonial arrival in the area, composed of independent villages headed by chiefs. As the story says, a local chief's daughter named Laipani, played by muses in the street parade, suffered an ailment that the healers could not cure. Laipani was carried to the river so the community could begin their petition to the god who was believed to reside there. On the way to the river, the group accompanying Laipani passed by a crowd of natives receiving baptism from a Spanish friar. The chief reprimanded the natives for allowing themselves to be baptized into the Christian faith. At that instant, the chief fainted in his angered reprimand. The Spanish priest quickly baptized the chief as well, who then awoke, miraculously recovered. The sickly daughter was also healed after her baptism. The narrative has other iterations. Sometimes performances, such as the one you can see on the screen depict natural disasters such as fire or earthquakes, each resolved with the miraculous intervention of the divine. In the story of Nabua's first miracle, Christian conversion brought by the colonial encounter marks the beginning of Nabua's salvation from life's uncertainties. What the narrative from the festival tells is that of the reducción, or the formation of settlements organized around the Christian faith following Spanish arrival, which in turn led to the transformation of settlements into compact encomiendas or villages that could be easily missionized and taxed, and whose residents could be recruited to work in the farms. The authentic narrative of harvest, indigeneity, and resilience from diseases and natural calamities in the festival were in fact manufactured in 1974 under the leadership of the local mayor at that time, his wife, the school's district supervisor, and the cultural committee coming from Manila. An informant recalls that she was fifth grade at the Nabua Elementary School in 1975 when they were asked to practice dance steps to participate in the festival for the very first time. In Nabua and in other places all over the Philippines, festivals sprouted in response to dictator Ferdinand Marcos's national program that tasked local leaders to craft a distinct brand for towns and cities that was supposed to cultivate a sense of local pride while participating in cultural events that could be marketed to local and international tourists. Oops. Interestingly, in the festival narrative, the local population is portrayed as a sickly people who needed salvation, even if the colonial archives from the town indicate hundreds of deaths from diseases that were most likely brought in by the colonial arrival. For example, the local archives in Nabua documented in a book of records called the Cuaderno, or the notebook, documents uh, or the notebook that for the year 1689, the pests arrived, 3 to 6 children and adults die daily. For the year 1729, cholera arrived in the entire province. The Cuaderno records numerous accounts from death from various diseases. The local archives also document forced conscription of local men for work elsewhere at undefined occupations, with mothers worrying that they might never see their sons again. The annual festival is an elaborate set of events with many elements, spanning for a week or two. The set of events includes the recital of a local novena for 9 consecutive days during the festival season. The town's history that is recorded in the Cuaderno is appropriated in the novena. Each day, the prayer leader recites a section called Chapters of History. For example, on day 6, the leader begins with, quote, on the years 1791, 1846, 1857, 1917, 1918, and 1919, many people suffered because the rice grains were withered by the sun and there was nothing to harvest, end quote. Curiously, whatever anguish felt in Nabua wrought by colonialism is absent in the novena. in effect, painting a picture of Nabua's past as one that is underscored by a long history of grieving, mostly caused by natural disasters. Deaths from fatal epidemic diseases that are recorded in the Cuaderno or in the historical text are minimized in the Novena, even if the Novena sources its integrity from the same historical text. For 1791, the Cuaderno draws a very clear picture of the condition in Nabua during the Spanish colonization. I quote, "The people are starving and they are being lashed by those in power in the town under the belief that they are indolent." I always find it difficult when I read this part. Okay. Pointing to the historical accounts in the Novena, my former high school teacher, who is a devout, just give me a moment, church leader in Nabua, told me during an interview about religious festivals in Nabua. She told me, "Look, Dada, this really happened. The monument, the street parade, and performance at my high school, supported by oral histories and religious novenas, mask colonial trauma." In fact, Leipani does not appear in the archives, and her origin is unclear. The street parade, the dance performance, oral history, and claims to indigeneity celebrate a narrative of assimilation that echoes a history told from the standpoint of colonizers, in which the native population needed aid and salvation. On this day alone, throughout the year, Nobuenos make claims to indigeneity as a form of tracing their roots, but not necessarily to reflect on the violences of multiple colonialisms on themselves. Meanwhile, the rest of the year, the monument of the Agta is affixed at the Centro, silently but prominently echoing racist and evolutionary colonial science about the supposed defeat of the original inhabitants in the town who had to withdraw to the mountains in the neighboring city of Iriga. Without consent or permission from the Agta, living only less than 5 miles away, the statue of the Agta and the cooptation of indigeneity during festivals appear like empty commemorations. Nobuenos have learned to perpetuate the racialized narratives about the Agta, whose monument shows them as frozen in time, as if having nothing else to do but play bamboo slit drums and dance. Okay. The second monument. The second monument is nestled in a small fenced park, just a few meters away from the statue of the Agta. It is named dedicated to the unknown soldier of Nabua. It is a rather unmonumental wall with textured cream-colored bricks against which a replica rifle with a military hard hat on its muzzle is propped. Etched on a marble plaque embedded on the brick wall are the names of the 1962 Nabua Summer Festival Queen and her court, and the members of a local club of male professionals who helped raise funds to build the monument. The monument gives no indication for which alliance the honorable but unknown soldiers of Nabua had fought. It remains unclear until today if the town collectively honors the anti-Japanese guerrillas who took to the hills during World War II, or the Filipinos fighting with the United Philippine-US military forces, or the USAFE, also during World War II, or perhaps even both. I have observed that people in Nabua prefer to keep some details unknown, wanting to send me the message that he knew about my genealogy as I asked to interview him about his life story. A retired US Navy man told me that he has heard that one of my elders was a member of the guerrilla movement during the Japanese occupation. I was excited to learn more and potentially discover revolutionary roots, but he refused to elaborate, saying that it might be a family secret kept away from the next generation. Sharing the list of US Navy retirees that I was planning to interview, my uncle told me in a hushed tone to erase one of the names who had submitted fraudulent documents in their youth to join the US Navy, and for other reasons he would not say more. Interviewing the only son of the US Navy man from Nabua who was killed in the attack of Pearl Harbor and whose name is memorialized on the tablets of the missing in Manila, in the Manila American Cemetery, I was told instructively, one does not rob fresh wounds. Listening to a shipmate narrate his life story during a recorded interview, which included forced labor in the Japanese imperial camps in the region when he was a teenager, leading to what he called was the lowest point of his life, when he had to leave his wife behind as the US naval ship sailed away from Manila to invade Incheon in South Korea. A retired Navy man said that there was so much he did not know despite their lifelong friendship. In my high school in Nabua, there used to stand what was known to us Nabuenos as the war damaged building. It was a tired wooden building with shell windows and creaky floors, elevated from the ground, supported by trunks of wood. We held typewriting lessons in one of its rooms, as there were not enough personal computers to support our learning. According to Nabuenos, the building was an outpost by the Japanese during World War II, or perhaps a clinic. People did not really know, and they were always unsure when asked. When asked about the experience of war locally, elders would typically say that they do not remember deaths nor abuses by the Japanese, even if massive atrocities were reported in other places in the Philippines. The war damaged building, a witness to World War II's history, whose details locals do not seem to want to articulate, was demolished a few years ago without resistance from Nabuenos, while peoples in other places might launch a call for its preservation of such artifact. If decoloniality is a project that aspires for decolonial futures, that includes reckoning with a painful and traumatic past, and if it must involve people from the global south as tellers of knowledge in their own right, then decolonization is complicated by such celebrations of the unknown and by frames of mind that center non-revelation and silence. The third monument is a concrete obelisk that stands just a couple of meters away from the unknown soldier of Nabwa, and that names a specific alliance and historical narrative. This monument is a replica of the Washington Monument, flanked by the Philippine and American flags, built with donations from Nabuenos with US Navy legacies. At about only 5 meters in height, it is nowhere near the scale of the original, but it occupies the center of the fenced park, somewhat blocking the unknown soldier's monument. As the iconic Washington Monument was built to honor Continental Army official and first US President George Washington, the replica was built to commemorate the ton of dollars owned great men. According to the memorial plate attached to its base, the monument was an initiative of the Nabua US Veterans Memorial Organization, built in recognition of military service of Nabuenos. The organization's emblem shows an American bald eagle resting on the corrupt canton of both US and Philippine flags. Some names of US Navy men are listed on the plaque under a heading that says in memoriam, even if the majority of the names listed have not yet sailed on. Sailed on is a term that one of my informants used to refer to the death of or the passing away of US Navy men. Crosses, crucifixes, and KIA or killed in action are affixed after the names of those who have passed. The Nabuenos in the US Navy who have retired in Nabua are among the last of their kind. The recruitment of Filipinos into the US Navy stopped in 1991 when the Philippine Supreme Court voted on the unconstitutionality, I can never pronounce this word, of the US Navy, of the US bases in the Philippines as American colonization ended in 1946. As long as their health allows, the retirees exert energy in staging annually held activities such as the flags raising ceremony of both the US and Philippine flags, as you can see on the photograph, at the Centro, to commemorate the lives of those who served in the US military force, which also include Nabueno shipmates. Shipmates is a term that they call each other. They donate buildings and infrastructure for public use named after themselves, fund community feasts, or collectively contribute resources for constructing memorials such as the Washington Monument replica, which will hopefully stay on long after their deaths. The narratives by retirees that I have interviewed also commonly reflect a lively and positive account of American colonization in the Philippines, even if the historical record tells of the grave destruction caused by colonial wars in the Philippines. Some of them acknowledge in subtle tones that their labor in the US Navy was racialized, gendered, and infantilized. In recalling their life histories, they commonly talked about the past as temporarily marked by periods of political and economic instability caused by competing empires on the Philippine soil and by elite post-colonial governments which have caused additional harm instead of repair. But also for the retirees, the US Navy opened a space for resisting the trope of the indolent Indio, or the Indian, ascribed by the Spanish to the colonized Filipino natives. While they were called boys by American naval officers, even if they were adults, and even if they had to perform menial tasks, which included shining officers' boots, they saw the Navy as a passage through which they could renegotiate their position in Nabua's hierarchical social class and orient their labor on the ships back to their left behind family in Nabua. In these colonized peoples, future, kin, and community oriented projects that were also hinged on capital accumulation, they arguably disrupted assumptions about the modern Filipino subject that was meant to be individualized by American colonial education. A decolonial frame emerging from settler nations such as the US would raise critique against institutions such as the military that were among the actors in the racial capitalist ventures of empires that dispossessed indigenous peoples of their ancestral land, extracted resources and labor overseas that funded and powered imperial projects. Nabuenos in the US Navy commonly deny their participation in imperial projects. They highlighted that their work in the mess halls and bunks were merely peripheral and not ensanguined, unlike their US born counterparts who carry guns and kill enemies on the ground, according to them. Looking at the retirees' case, decoloniality appears to be premised on contributing to global history inscribed in local memory. The experience of trauma from working long hours on the naval ships in racialized and gendered occupations, trauma from separation from family, among others, are muted. Public monuments in cooperation with local governments and residents and private monuments as well, such as their personal mausoleums, which you can see on the screen, are productively deployed by retirees in crafting a distinct identity and asserting relevance despite residing in the margins of historiography and in claiming participation in history making. The replica of the Washington Monument, among their other projects, reflects their desires to be memorialized kindly after death in the modest town experiencing the after effects of multiple colonialisms, where their dollar remittances were recuperative for kin and community. The monuments in the town of dollars that I introduced today reflect a conundrum about how decolonization becomes a challenging project in a context in which the aftermaths of multiple colonialisms have muddled daily life. The Three Agta monument signifies how formerly colonized peoples may craft memory-making projects that echo Europe's racist evolutionary perspectives. Nabuenos unwittingly tokenize the indigenous other and celebrate narratives that subdue their experience of dispossession and violence as peoples who have become entangled in various imperial projects. The monument dedicated to the unknown soldier of Nabua materializes the ambiguity that characterizes people's understanding of their hometown as a site of war with confusing alliances. The replica of the Washington Monument makes visible people's desires to be remembered for their contribution to the making of the town through their racialized labor in the US naval ships, narratives of which they tend to downplay during conversations. Within critical and decolonial theory, These monuments would be seen as problematic to varying degrees because they exemplify formerly colonized people's unchecked complicities in imperial projects. This is from Tuck and Young. Or they might also be critiqued for their miseducation, as Filipino historian Constantino says, and also because of their ignorance about themselves, and that one is from Pareñas. These monuments would seem to signal a need for epistemological revision so that false consciousness could be corrected and so that trauma could be claimed and healing could proceed. These monuments reflect only some of Nobuena's reflections on the colonialisms that unfolded locally, all oriented at offering supposed respectful commemorations for the indigenous, the unknown, and the elderly, even if these articulations might be imperfect. I'm concluding. The monuments in Nabua that I discussed today are unlike the colonial monuments facing historical reckoning globally. Ravaged over the years by tropical storms, the public library and school building, donated by a retired US Navy man, my great grand uncle, are now gone, not staying on long enough after their philanthropist had sailed on. Potential historical markers such as the war damaged building, even if they could be recuperated, fall without much noise or resistance from residents. Elsewhere, decolonization movements were envisioned in the context of an epistemic break after centuries of colonization. In South Africa, this epistemic break has produced a student-led ongoing liberation project that launched decolonial projects such as the Rhodes Must Fall movement. Decolonizing local epistemologies is a luxury that many people in Nabua cannot afford. However, I want to think that an attempt to open debates whether the monuments in Nabua must fall or not, among other confounding reverberations of colonialisms, would not be a pointless project if we were to look at it as potentially opening a space for inquiring into people's supposed resilience to instead meditate on trauma and to plan for action for repair and healing. In the town of Dollars, public and collective conversations about multiple colonial trauma have not yet occurred. The conflicting narratives that the trinity of monuments in the town of Dollars altogether register on a monumental scale reflect the anxious responses of a people to locally experienced multiple colonialisms. These anxieties, cemented in the form of monuments fixed in the town's most central location, are hyper-visible structures with histories that could be triangulated. From this, the colonial features could be assembled. That's all. Thank you. And this is a Christmas decoration from last year in my hometown.
Thank you so much, Dada. That was an incredibly rich and really, really powerful and thought-provoking presentation. And I'm sure many people will have lots of things to discuss and lots of responses to your really, really interesting and really sort of compelling meditation. So we're gonna move into the question and answer session now, and I'm going to use the chair's privilege to maybe just try and kick things off with a question. And one of the things that really sort of struck me as you were talking through these really amazingly sort of intriguing examples from Nabua was the role of, I guess, silence or refusal in these cases. And I was reminded a little bit of Tuck's earlier article. I can't remember the exact title, but it was about kind of refusing, she was calling for a sort of moratorium on damage-centered research on Indigenous communities where she was kind of pushing back against this tendency to pathologize Indigenous communities or marginalized communities as only being oppressed and only being powerless. And I was just wondering about where we might locate the role of silence and refusal, to use Audra Simpson's term as well, in these projects of healing and repair that you're talking about. Because I think in some ways, the sort of knee-jerk reaction to problems of monumentalization, for example, has been to get rid of them, but also to kind of make as visible as possible alternative histories, alternative realities, and so on. But during your presentation, I was sort of getting the sense that in some cases, rather than revealing and rather than making visible, a preferable option for some people in dealing with this trauma would have been to keep silent or to kind of refuse disclosure, any further disclosure and engagement. And so I was just wondering if that was something that you could maybe just pull out a little bit for us, this role that silence and refusal might play in this project as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for listening. And yeah, I was coughing a little bit, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, so I think silence and refusal is a core, um, a very important value, I think, in the Philippines that might be in contrast with anthropological or ethnography's effort to draw out information, right? And in the beginning, I was very confused by this. I did not really understand what was going on, why people did not want to talk. And because I think in anthropological training, we are oriented that we are supposed to hang out, right? To do to be a fly on the wall or something like that, to be a participant observer. But even though we are invited to a lot of festivals and to a lot of birthday parties and events, which might also be, in my case, a lot of family members' events, when it comes to talking about difficult things, difficult life stories, those are very much delayed in terms of revelation. And for example, I mentioned a little bit my film, which was titled Bad ng Pauno or Restless. And this was already screened worldwide via the Filipino diaspora channel. And so a lot of people have seen it, and it was already screened outside the Philippines several times. And my mother was very proud of that achievement, right? Because in places such as the Philippines, usually when you're an artist, it's people seem to not have a good conception if one becomes an artist, because then you are not productive in the modern Filipino sense, right? Because we're supposed to be doctors or engineers or nurses, right? But because of the prestige attached to it, when there were invited talks to screen the film, I guess it sort of became prestigious, and my family carried that pride back to the hometown. And when I was going home, I thought like, okay, so let's screen this film, which was already seen overseas anyway. My mother suddenly crashed and said like, no, let's not show this film. And she was so upset and anxious. And she told me, you can screen this film after I leave again for the United States. She did not want to be part of the audience. She did not want to join the artist talk or the casting talk. And I even had a grand plan with local poets participating and doing a panel. But my mother was also like she held a position called the barangay captain, who is like a village captain, not really village chief, because we are not indigenous peoples, but like a head of the village, right? And she held that position for 13 years. And um, her position as a leader, as a local politician, contrasted so much with the image that she projects on the screen, which is a desperate person wanting to go to the US as a migrant, because the film Bad ng Pauno is a 2-day documentation of her venture to Manila to apply for a US tourist visa, right? And the prestige projected at home does not match the status of a desperate visa seeker. And in the beginning, I was forcing her. I was telling her, I just want to help. I just want to, show some art. And this idea of helping, of showing some art does not work at home. And I think it's the same for a lot of other, people who did not really want to talk about their trauma on the U.S. naval ships, or actually they do talk about them, but in subtle tones. And the point is that I can't imagine, I think it's hard for me to imagine that as an outsider I will be coming in to ask about these questions, because even as a family member, it's hard for me to inquire into these. So I think I commend anthropologists to go and seek out information and who are able to draw out very dramatic stories. But I also began to think that maybe that layer of being a neighbor or a family member shows an additional obstacle because they cannot say, because then there's also the idea of the concept of gossip, right? That Dada might tell. Yeah, so I think silence is very much present um, in ethnography, and it's important to listen to this silence, to take note of the silence, and to analyze around that. And it's only recently that I began to think about trauma, as I mentioned in my presentation, because I did not see it before as trauma until I began reading about trauma, and I thought like, oh yes, it might be trauma actually.
Great, thank you. And I think that's something that many anthropologists can learn from. Okay, I've got a bit of a queue of questions here. So, so everyone, please feel free to turn your cameras back on if you want. So the first question is from Eric, please.
Okay, thank you, Dada, for a very interesting seminar. My question's sort of a bit of a tangent, but I'll ask it anyways. I was very intrigued by the fact that so many people in the town there become part of the US Navy. And I was wondering whether what you find in the Philippines is that certain towns or areas have a monopoly on certain routes of migration, and whether that's a factor here, that basically your town is known as the place where people go and join the Navy, whereas other places they go and join the NHS or what have you.
Hi, yeah, thanks for that question. Yes, I think it's much connected to kinship practices. When one joins a particular task, then they recruit others to the same job. And I think it's the same among my informants. There were one family with 7 boys. All of them became eventually US Navy men, and they also recruited their cousins and their brothers so that they descend from a sort of a US naval lineage, right? But it's somehow, and I think the same with nurses. Most of my family members here in the US are nurses, because one becomes a nurse and then another becomes a nurse, because there's the road has been paved, I guess, and kinship plays an important role in this. And I also had a paragraph that I deleted from this presentation because it was going to get very long, but I wanted to mention the other monikers used in the surrounding towns of my hometown. So Bato, the town of Bato, which is right beside Nabua.
I don't know. There's a power cut in California.
I think, is Liana frozen as well, or
No.
no? That was just Liana's expression.
Oh, there you are.
Disappeared.
I'm back, sorry.
Okay,
I don't know what happened.
Welcome back.
Oh.
Yeah. All right. So, and then there's just a little bit further away, there's the town of the Leaning Bell Tower. Yeah. So, and then the city of the town with the world's smallest fish. And these are monikers that are. I was telling my friend that, oh, I think this is a new paper, because monikers are special in the way that local governments actually play them up for history making and also for rejuvenating livelihood. But it's also interesting because most of them are based on monoculture, like tilapia. It's an introduced species, right? It's not local. And because of tilapia, the other towns' native species, the world's smallest fish, is dying. All right. So they sound cute, but they're actually very problematic, right? They have there's also trauma in them, right? But I mean, I'm from not for now, because I'm beginning to read a lot about trauma. They could be also traumatic in the sense of ecology, the formation of ecology and landscapes. And I think the problem with Nabo is that it seems to be because we are the town of dollars, there's no way that the hometown can, it's hard for the town to look for other forms of livelihood, for funding for other forms of livelihood, right? Because these towns are also, they also draw funding from the national government to help promote their local monoculture, right? So for example, the town of Tilapia gets funding to support their fishery. But I mean, and then the town of Bonbon can get funding from the Department of Tourism to support their boosting tourism around the Leaning Bell Tower, right? But for the town of dollars, it's basically just a migration-oriented moniker, and we are supposed to go. That's the orientation we are supposed to leave. So in a sense, it's sad. And people take pride in the moniker, but as I mentioned, most of the people in Nabwa are poor farmers, right? And I have a discussion on farmers who have been dispossessed generationally from their own land. And Nabwa has also one of the highest backlogs in returning agricultural land from the government, right? In terms of land reform. And they would tell me, when I would ask them what they think about the town of dollars, because I was coming from Canada during that time for my doctoral course, they would tell me, "Do you have any dollars there? Can you show us?" They would say that they have not seen dollars. The dollars the town is named after. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, thank you. Next question is from James, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for a very rich, very multi-layered kind of paper. There are lots of different areas that I think you could talk about more. So I'll try and be as straightforward as I can. I feel a bit guilty about asking you a question at 5 o'clock in the morning or whatever time it is in California. But I suppose I had a methodological question from something you said early on in the paper when you described your approach. I think this is how you described it, because the line went a bit crackly at that point. But I think you said something about, was it ethnographic meta-commentary, I think was the term that you used, which I was intrigued by. And you talked about it being, I think, experiential and protracted, but both of those things seem to describe, to me anyway, what I would see as ethnographic research more generally. So I wondered if maybe you could say a bit more about what that was and perhaps how that differed from, well, I was going to say from regular ethnography, if there is such a thing. But...
Yeah, maybe it's the same. No, it's ethnographic meta-commentary. So this came out last year, and I called it the one of the processes that I mentioned in the method is called furthering, and it's basically going on. I keep on going and finding different aspects.
Good one. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. So I go on and try to think about aspects that retreat from our ethnography. So maybe it is the same as what anthropologists and ethnographers do normally anyway. But here in this, in the project, in the method of ethnographic meta-commentary that I wrote about in current anthropology, what I did was I begin the analysis from a film that I made, and then I begin to analyze it. And the idea is that there are other aspects of the film itself as an ethnographic project that gets revealed as we process or as we think about different dimensions. So I think, for example, the film itself is only 3 minutes, and it was screened before in the Society of Visual Anthropology Film Festival. And I think it was one of the shorter ones, maybe, yeah, because it's only for 3 minutes, right? But from a 3-minute film, it's possible to draw so much, right? Which includes influences in terms of art practice from South America to the Philippines, in terms of activism at the University of the Philippines, and going to Japan to live as a migrant student. But I think it's a commentary also on the ways that anthropologists would say, oh, the context is complex. So here, the complexity is not only written down, but also performed, right? Because the film itself is a performance piece. And it's not only a commentary on, on how difficult it is to write around the project, but the complexity of living, of a brown body living in Japan when you are policed. So it's kind of, yeah, so I think it's a performative work, but also an ethnographic work. And I think that might be my contribution to kind of adding, to add to the discipline.
Okay, thanks. I will go and look at that article now.
Thank you. Thanks for reading.
Right, Maria.
Thank you, Dada, very much for this wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I would like you to tell us a little bit more about this notion of the privilege of decolonizing. And I think this is quite incisive in a lot of ways. In ways, and so if I could hear more about how it is for you as an anthropologist doing this research in your hometown, but also being an anthropologist, being an inside outside. Also perhaps a little bit more about, are there any other voices in political voices, attempts at political revision, or I mean, it sounds the ethnographic atmosphere that you give, and this is not my part of the world. I'm from Greece and I'm a Syrian expert, so I don't know anything about this part of the world. But your evocative presentation kind of gave me the feeling that the traumas of the past, the exploitation of the past that is still continues, is very much unspoken and, you know, almost performed over with, you know, different flashy dances that have that create a special distance and special ownership or distance. I don't know in the local with the local people. How do they relate to this? Perhaps how also the neighbors, like in the first monument of the indigenous people, how are the neighboring villages relate to this town of dollars and their depictions?
Yeah, thank you. Hi. Yeah, so I think aside from silences, and a lot of anthropologists have also written about this, but jokes, humor is also very much present in the hometown. And I have a lot of friends from the neighboring town of Iriga, where there are indigenous settlements. And then they would always say like, oh, the Nabwa people, the Nabuenos are stealing away our artifact, right? But it's so sad when we say that, right? Because these are very problematic statements. And there's a lot of humor that are also problematic and which go unchecked in the town, and which are very much reminiscent of very racist discourses against our neighbors, right? Who live just 5 miles away. And in terms of how people locally perceive the town, I think you're right that trauma is performed in a very grand way, to the point that they're almost like screaming at us, right? But the point is that, yeah, I was actually very quite confused by this, because it seems that people generally do not see trauma in this spectacle, right? I think it's an anthropological view or a very privileged standpoint to think of trauma, because basically in everyday life, it's, as I mentioned in my talk, it's a privilege to think about these things. I mean, right now, our home in Nabua has no roof, right? Because the biggest typhoon for the year in the whole world just struck our region. And as I type this up, we have a family chat room, and they post photos of the current efforts to repair our home. And yeah, they have no roof over there. And our role as family members overseas is try to help, right? To try to send some amount, to send remittances. And also, I'm not American, I'm a Filipino citizen, and I'm here on a US a work visa. Yeah, so there's also that privilege of looking at this, having the time to analyze this in ways that are unfortunately maybe not relatable to the people in my hometown. What was also fascinating was that the AITA monuments, the AGTA monuments, for example, usually they repaint the AGTA every year before the festival season, and it's sometimes they are of different skin tones, and it becomes a joke like, oh, why are the monuments of different color this time? Why are they whiter than the year before? So basically, I think the town sometimes does not know that by wanting to honor indigenous peoples, sometimes it doesn't really work. But yeah, yeah, I think yeah, I do not know how to approach this because I am overseas as well, right? And I do want to share what I know, but there's also like, it's like a different kind of savior complex, right? When when anthropologists go and do development work and they want to, I mean, it's like me wanting to go home and decolonize my own people. It's like a grand and a bit of narcissistic project, to be honest. But when I was telling my mom about my talk, she was like, "What do you mean?" Because these are supposed to be drawing tourists to our town, and during these festivals, we are able to get some money from tourists, right? And they also kind of boost solidarity within villages when they practice and perform dance performances, right? So in a sense, we have this idea of decolonization and that we must address our trauma and heal, but it goes against efforts to sustain people in terms of livelihood. So I don't know. I don't know yet. I have no answer whether or not it's truly possible to decolonize. Maybe it's not.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a question that a few of us are also struggling with. But, it's a really difficult one. Okay, I have a question from Andrew. Andrew, you've typed this in the chat. Do you want to ask this yourself?
Sure. Hi. Yeah. Thanks for a great talk. If I could just play devil's advocate for a moment, I'm wondering how useful or appropriate the notion of trauma is here, and if there are other ways of registering the terrible history people have suffered. The notion of trauma has a specific history in European thinking, as Ian Hacking and Ruth Lees have shown, a metaphorical transfer of the idea of physical injury to a psychic wound. But as critics of Western psychiatry have argued, the export of this concept of trauma and its associated psychodynamic conception of the person is itself an instance of psychiatric universalism or imperialism. The world is being recolonized through the soft power of global psychiatry. Trauma is one of its weapons.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. If you don't mind, I copied your note to my notepad so I can look at your the references that you mentioned here. Thank you. Yes. So I started reading on trauma theory only this year in the summer at the height of the BLM protests. And as I mentioned in my presentation, it was it was a concept that I completely ignored in the past. And I guess linking back to what I mentioned earlier about the process of furthering that I mentioned also in my current anthropology piece, I find my venture into trauma studies as part of that, as part of expanding the story so that I'm not drawing a conclusion, but trying to think of processually about the case, about how to understand silences and humor and other repercussions of multiple colonialisms in my hometown. And yeah, I do agree that it's a Western concept, right? But we also have, for example, this summer, I read Therese Mayotte's Heartberries. She's a Native American author, and she thinks about, in her book, about mental health, right? And how we could approach mental health in ways that are not Western centric. And that gave me, I think, such readings gave me the opening, as well as I mentioned Rothberg's idea of decolonizing trauma, that it probably is not really, there's also space for decolonizing trauma studies, right? And to think about it outside the Western conception of what you are saying here, for example, about physical injury or the psychic wound, right? And I think there's space for thinking about it decolonially.
If it is itself a concept very much associated with Western ideas of the person, do we want to export that around the world and then have the problem of decolonizing what we brought in?
I mean, what we are studying also in the Philippines are all hybrid, right? They are not in their original native condition. And we are all already importing ideas like since the world began. So I think it's okay. I think it's okay to transport ideas from the West and subvert them and to think about them and rethink them and think of ways how they might be useful as analytical concepts in a place that is so hybrid, right? Also, there was we think, for example, of Renato Rosaldo, right, who's probably one of the most famous theorists, anthropologists working on the Philippines. And when he was proposing to his supervisor before, this PhD supervisor, when he was proposing to study the Philippines, his supervisor before discouraged him to study the Philippines because his supervisor said the Philippines is not exotic enough. It's too hybrid. And that instead he should study Madagascar, right? And so I think it's the same idea that the Philippines is already hybrid. It has been interacting with the world since even before Spanish colonization. And that I think it's okay to transport ideas and to think about our condition using those. We are, after all, free human beings who can, borrow knowledges from the rest of the world.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay, yes, that's very apt, certainly for Southeast Asia in general, isn't it? It's a very, very hybrid space. Okay, I've got a question from Alexandra.
Thank you. Apologies if you mentioned this in your talk and I missed it, but did Filipinos sit passively back and wait for Spain to withdraw, or what did they fight for their independence? Like the Cubans, for example, who basically threw them out.
Oh, the Filipinos at that time, it was in 1898. Yes. When the Philippines, along with Cuba, Guam, and others who were Spanish colonies and Puerto Rico were sold to the US under the Treaty of Paris, right? And then the Americans arrived.
No, but I'm asking a different question. Did they fight for their independence? The Cubans fought for their independence. My great-grandmother, who was born into third world poverty, sat with a rifle in her kitchen and shot 3 Spanish soldiers dead. It's just wondering how passive actually were they historically?
I think the historical record says that a lot of groups did fight against the Spanish, and we did try to throw them out. And in 1898, some historical accounts say that the Filipino Revolutionary Army was already winning.
Yes.
And there wasn't,
Yeah. So, but my point is really that one could argue that revolution is a means of successfully recovering from collective trauma.
So the question is whether or not Filipinos fought against Spain?
Yes, you know, what sort of percentage of people were actively involved in trying to, you know, gain independence. And
Yeah,
again,
so
following the Cuban Revolution, was there a movement in the Philippines to get rid of US control? You know,
yes,
many Latin American countries to fight. And I'm just, you know, because it does feel like a very passive history you're offering.
oh yeah, so based on different there are different arguments about this because the Philippines is an archipelago with over 7,000 islands, right? So I think the geography itself made it very difficult for Filipinos at that time to fight as a one whole entity, right? Because of the geographical formation itself, which is difficult to organize nationally in terms of having just one unified revolution. But a lot of historical accounts do say that there was a Tagalog Manila-centered revolution. And in the historical accounts of my hometown, people did flee, did go to the hills to fight against both Spanish and Americans. So yes, there were revolutions every time.
Yeah.
But the thing was in the Philippines, even if we were colonized for 3 centuries by Spain, education was not given to the Filipinos, to the Indios, right? And this is one of the reasons why we're also able to maintain a lot of native languages. We were not taught Spanish, and we were not given education, and we were kept at the level of Indio, right? And when the Spanish came, when the Americans came, the Americans had a different offering. They decided, oh, the Filipinos are still ignorant and still uneducated, so let's give them free education. And there was also the case of the very long cholera epidemic, right? And the cholera epidemic folded with a lot of problems during American colonial period. So it was just a mess. And the Filipinos at that time, according to a lot of historical accounts, really just could not fight anymore and gave in to the Americans coming, because the Americans had new offerings which were not the same as what the Spanish offered. So in the case of my hometown, even if there were accounts of people fleeing to the hills to fight against the Americans only within 20 years, it was just really fascinating how quick the assimilation was, right? And the American project in the Philippines was also called Benevolent Assimilation. They said they were not going to assimilate violently, but actually they did. But they had different offerings in terms of giving us free education. And because of a lot of colonial wars happening between some remaining war between the US and Spain and local revolutionary forces fighting against the US, there was a lot of stunted agricultural, the agricultural planting seasons were all muddled and people were not having food anymore, but the Americans were giving food to the local people all over the Philippines. So because of such conditions of desperation and hunger, it was just easier, according to a lot of historical accounts, to give in, to give up, and to
I think Cuba
assimilate.
might be an interesting point of comparison, because the regime in Cuba was also very brutal. But anyway, I'll just leave it there, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're coming close to the end of this seminar slot. Does anybody else have a very, very quick question that I can give a quick answer to? Anyone? Okay, in that case, I think we're going to bring things to a close because I know some students have to go on to a different class. But I just want to say a huge thank you once again to Dada for such an incredibly compelling and rich paper. I think that was food for thought for many of us, and we'll be mulling over what you've said for quite a while. So thank you once again, Dada. It was a real pleasure to have you with us and to learn more about your research. And yes, and I look forward to seeing everyone else next week for what will be our last research seminar for the term. So yes, thank you once again, Dada. And
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.